Right, so again, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our roundtable on systemic racism in Indigenous communities in Alberta today. This roundtable is part of our Challenging Discrimination through Community Conversation series, and we will discuss the specific challenges and discriminations Indigenous communities face in Alberta. Our panelists are Lana Whiskeyjack, she's the assistant professor at the University of Alberta. Bernadette Iatel, she's the executive director of Creating Hope Society. And Jodi Stonehouse, executive director, Yellowhead Indigenous Education Foundation. And they will speak to the issue of colonial and post-colonial history and identity politics in Alberta, Indigenous communities' sense of belonging and experiences of discrimination, as well as access to resources. In this session, we will also look at different ways to identify and challenge discriminatory attitudes and behaviors in our practices. Even though we are not gathered in the same physical space, we would like to acknowledge that CFRAC is situated on the land of Treaty 6 territory, traditional homelands for many Indigenous peoples. With this acknowledgement, we pay our respect to the elders past and present who call this land home, and remind all of us gathered here today of the responsibilities we have as treaty people to understand our shared colonial history and work together towards a just future that includes and enriches all peoples. At the Center for Race and Culture, we are trying to go beyond a formal land acknowledgement and connect it to our current socio-political milieu in Canada and consider our parts as individuals responding to acts of discrimination and moving towards a more inclusive society. As new settlers in this country, and I am a new settler myself, our perspective of Indigenous peoples is shaped by the legacies of colonialism. There are few, if any, direct interactions between new settlers and Indigenous peoples. And much of what newcomers to Canada learn about Indigenous communities is informed by a colonial mentality and deeply rooted negative stereotypes. And while the Truth and Reconciliation Commission issued 94 calls to action to address the legacy of residential schools and move toward reconciliation, for many of us, it is unclear what reconciliation could or should look like in our everyday lives. A starting point is to take responsibility, recognize and acknowledge our own role in the legacies of colonialism, which continue to shape and oppress Indigenous lives, so that we can seek out ways to work in solidarity with Indigenous communities. The impacts of colonial oppression do not simply disappear with the closing of residential schools or the TRC, and we are only beginning to understand the intergenerational psychological and physical damages. So I have a few statistics here of Indigenous communities, specifically young people in Indigenous communities. 40% of young people live in poverty. They are 6 times more likely to be killed than anyone else in the country. 39.8% have not completed their high school diploma. 48% of all children in foster care are Indigenous. 6 out of 10 people aged 12 and older are diagnosed with at least one chronic illness. And 32% of Indigenous schools have issues with access to clean drinking water. These statistics seem almost unreal in a wealthy country such as Canada and urge us to find tangible ways in which we can all address and remedy these disparities. Since its establishment in 1993, the Center for Race and Culture, formerly known as Northern Alberta Alliance on Race Relations, has brought together diverse people with an interest in promoting and supporting individual, collective, and systemic change to address discrimination and racism, and to encourage intercultural understanding. Taking an intersectional approach, our expertise spans workplace development, community building, research, and education. This session is part of a new initiative titled Challenging Discrimination through Community Conversations, and this is an ongoing series of online moderated roundtables and webinars with guest speakers from diverse community organizations, academia, and the general public. We seek to understand and address experiences of discrimination and exclusion in the Canadian context, And by shining the spotlight on different forms of discrimination, such as anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, and discrimination against Asian communities, amongst other topics, we hope to encourage solidarity among groups and individuals interested in promoting social inclusion and equity. This is a community-based initiative, and we do welcome ideas and suggestions for collaboration. Please don't hesitate to reach out to my colleague Mansouri or myself if you would like to be part of our future conversations. And you can also use the feedback form, which we will share with you during this event, to let us know about any thoughts or questions that you may have. So we are just going to run a very quick poll, as we have done in previous events. This is anonymous, and it is entirely voluntary if you wish to add your information, but it does help us to have a better understanding about who our audience is, and to also further tailor these sessions in the future for our audiences. So we'll give you just a minute to complete the poll. All right, thank you everyone for sharing the information. I now have the great pleasure to introduce our speakers today. It is an honor to have these three very passionate and very knowledgeable ladies on our panel here today. So first, please let me introduce Lana Whiskeyjack. She's a multidisciplinary Treaty Iskew artist from Saddle Lake Cree Nation, Treaty 6 territory in Alberta. Guided by her grandmother's advice, go to school, travel, and see as much as you can. Then return home to share what you learned, but do not forget where you came from. She graduated high school and as a young mom moved to Red Deer to attain her art and design diploma, then moved to Ottawa with her growing family, where she attained a BA and an MA degree. The story continues with returning to work near her home community and attaining her doctorate degree at the University of Blue Quills, the first Indigenous owned and operated educational institution in Canada. Prior to 1970s, UNBQ operated as Blue Quills as an Indian residential school where 2 generations of her maternal family attended. Lana's research, writing, and art explores the paradoxes of what it means to be Nahiwa, Cree, and Iskew woman in a Western culture and society, and how she and other Indigenous peoples are reclaiming, regathering, and remembering their ancestral medicine, sacredness, and power. Her art is passionate and expressive, born from the deep roots of her culture, history, and intergenerational relations. Through the examination of sometimes difficult subjects, her art reflects the intrinsic beauty of her interconnections with the earth, Cree language, and all living beings. She invites you to join her on the next chapter of her adventure. Our next participant is Bernadette Iatel. She is a recipient of the Angel Among Us, Canadian Association of Social Work Award, I'm sorry, I hope I pronounced this correctly, Whiskeyjack Circle of Shared Responsibility and Stewardship, Walk of Honors, John Humphrey Center, Gerald L. Gall Award for Peace and Human Rights, and her personal story documentation in the Canadian Human Rights Museum located in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Former president of the Edmonton Intercultural Center, board of director at Boyle Street Chartered School, and she was also a member of the Edmonton Coalition for Human Rights and the Aboriginal Coalitions of Edmonton and Stony Plain Aboriginal Leadership Team. And finally, Jodi Stonehouse, who is a I'm so sorry, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Haudenosaunee and Nehiwa from the Michelle First Nation. Jodi is currently the Executive Director of Yellowhead Indigenous Education Foundation, a charitable foundation committed to supporting Indigenous students, land-based education, and language curriculum development. Jodi is the mother of 2 teenagers and a teenage puppy dog. Jodi is a film producer, director, and an award-winning Indigenous radio show host and an Indigenous innovator. Her areas of interest are Indigenous legal traditions, Indigenous innovation, social enterprise, and Indigenous storytelling. Just a couple of words about myself. I'm the research coordinator at the Center for Race and Culture, where I'm currently working on the Understanding Newcomer Experiences of Inclusion Research project, and the final report of this project will come out early next year. I'm also currently completing my PhD degree at Concordia University in Montreal in history and anthropology, and my focus is specifically on difficult heritage in public memory and curatorial interventions. I take a strong interest in how societies and individuals deal with historical trauma such as racism, discrimination, persecution, and genocide, and how such memories are silenced and re-emerge and are made visible in society. So we now get started with our roundtable conversation. So please welcome with me our 3 panelists. And I would like to pose this first question, and whoever of our 3 speakers would like to go first, I would like to invite you to comment on this question. So we had a previous conversation, and during the conversation it was mentioned how systemic racism has led to a deeply embodied and internalized experience of oppression among Indigenous peoples. Can you speak to how these external forces and internal experiences impact an individual's ability to understand and speak about their experiences of discrimination and oppression? Bernadette, I believe you're muted.
Yeah, I'll start.
Okay, wonderful, thank you.
I don't know if you can see me. I can't see myself. Yeah. Anyhow, I just want to show you the feather. And this feather really influenced me. And it was from Elijah Harper when he said no to Mishlake Accord. And when that happened, there was an awakening that happened to me. It was like when he said, "We, the first people of Canada." And there was an awakening that happened. And that awakening was like, wow, I am the first people of Canada. Why do I feel the way that I feel? Why do I feel that I'm just a small little peon in this earth and I don't mean anything? And I realized that from the day that I was born into a systemic Indian affairs, whatever you want to call it, legislation that affected me, my life. As a child, I was put in an orphanage when I was 2 years old, and I grew up in child welfare from the time that I was probably 4 years old. So I stayed in an orphanage for 2 years. And my cousin, who is Edmund Matawabin, real well-known person in Ontario, probably across Canada, and he said to me, he said, "Why would you be taken away? You know, why would you be taken away? Your grandmother, you were living with your grandmother was raising you." But that's another story. But when I think about how it affected me from the time that I was born. And when I met this wonderful elder, her name was Shawanda, Elder Shawanda, and she came from Saskatchewan. And I remember sitting down with her. I was probably in my 30s. And she said to me, she says, "You know, Bernadette, this happened before you were born. So we have been living in this oppression, you know, the 4 walls of prisons. I call that the 4 walls of prisons because that's what it was. You know, you look at the residential school, child welfare, the Indian residential school, and justice. And we call that the 4 walls of prison. And that's how I seen my life. And part of it is that, you know, most of my life where I went to, whether I went to school or whether I went, you know, I worked in a society, I was always called, you know, a dirty little Indian, or you'll amount to nothing, or you will, you know, you're just a drunk. And, you know, I grew up in that kind of environment, and it took me a long time to be able to move my life forward, because I didn't understand where I came from. I didn't understand, you know, the system that was created and how it impacted me, my life. It impacted my family, impacted my community. It impacted the people that I knew that grew up in care with me. And when we would look at each other, you know, we would stare at each other. Oh my God, we'd stare at each other. Oh my God, there's another brown face there. They look like me, you know, because we were so far apart from each other. And that's exactly what they wanted. They wanted to divide us. And they did a good job of that, you know. But when I seen this feather, and when I seen Elijah Harper, there was an awakening that happened inside of me. And that's a long time ago, back in 1987. So it's been a long journey. And today, the work that I'm doing, I talk about the systemic racism, and I talk about what our kids go through. And you said, I seen your stats was 48% of children are in care. I believe it's higher than that. It's 60%. And so, because I've been working with the child welfare system for a long time. So that's another, anyhow, I'm going to stop there because I could talk on forever, and I'll let my other colleagues talk.
Thank you so much, Bernadette. Jodi or Lana, would you like to go next?
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Bernadette, for beginning. I'd like to actually begin with prior to systemic racism, or the oppressive systems we live in now, and is that I'd like to kind of set a spiritual body, mind, land, cosmos foundation for as part of my conversation. As a reminder to myself as a Nehio Esquel, but also as a protection for the words we are sharing. This is really, you know, the questions we're looking at today, as Jodi mentioned in some of our previous conversations. You can write volumes of books from, you know, doctorate dissertations from. But as a Nehio, a human being of four, body, mind, and spirit emotions, the four elements, the four seasons, the four soils, the four relations, and many more, we're pretty quaternity peoples, is I've inherent language and knowledge and medicines and roles and responsibilities to this land and to all my relations. As an Esquel, a firekeeper, a life giver, a mother, a grandmother, a daughter, a granddaughter, Chapan, educator, artist, I am from Nagawiya Ski, from this Mother Earth, what we now of course call Turtle Island in Canada, Alberta, Treaty 6. And it is within our languages that, you know, of the languages of this land that we're reminded of our inherent connections and laws of being in relation with one another. And so, you know, as I'm learning Nehiawe, the Cree language, it's almost like an awakening, as Bernadette was talking about her eagle feather. And for me, it's like within the language, when I say Lana Whiskeyjack Nitsigason Onyxkoponikotsinia, you know, the root words of my name and I am from is my belly button connections, those Utsi connections. You know, I am honoring the wombs that I come from. And so I've also inherit a lot of what the wombs I come from, their pain, their oppression, their hurts, their joys, their knowledge, their skills. And so when I think about, you know, this question around looking at, you know, the external forces and the internal experience and the impact on our ability to understand and speak about the experience of discrimination and oppression, it's really important to also, well, as many of us from, you know, learn from our families, is to know where you come from. That prior to these systems, there was a way that we were honored, especially as women, right? And so, and it is those kind of reminders and honoring and looking at the patterns that actually disconnect us from our spirit, from one another, our family systems, our, you know, the connection to our own spirit. And it has it's so important that we also, you know, when we look at those systems, realize that it is not our fault. Just that, you know, that we carry so much trauma and oppression, as to me as a woman, in our wombs, and we've passed that on. As I felt like I've carried so much of being a child and a grandchild of Indian residential schools, and from, you know, impact by the, you know, different policies and laws that purposely oppressed us. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Lana. Jodi, would you like to add to this as well?
Thank you for the introduction and for the invitation to be here. And it's great to be with Bernadette and Lana to speak with such powerful, incredible women who've done extraordinary things for Indigenous people. And I really admire and respect the work that they've done. So it's a real honor to sit with both of these powerful, beautiful Squayawaks. You know, this question in itself is really problematic for me as I think about, you know, systemic racism and this embodied experience of oppression. It seems to me when we're asking Indigenous people themselves to talk about how has this shit really hurt you, you know, it sort of reifies the violence. And so when we come to talk about these questions, we're also bringing our lived experience, because we don't live outside of the systemic racism in Canada. Actually, our lives are completely embedded in them. So when, you know, Bernadette talks about the great Elijah Harper, who touched so many lives and made such great systemic change, he did it simply by holding a feather and by being silent. And those statistics that you showed earlier, are those not enough evidence for you to see how the oppression is being lived out in our lives, that our people are dying, that we are not graduating from high school, right? That our children are being apprehended, which means we have just as many moms and dads without their babies. So, you know, how can we move away is my question. How can we move away from the retelling of the violence and re-engaging Indigenous people in perpetuating systemic violence, but build different systems of hope and systems of solutions? Because I'm finding this continuous reification of the problem isn't necessarily helping us move out of the systemic racism, which of course has led to the marginalization and oppression of Indigenous peoples.
Thank you, Jodi, and also thank you for pointing out that the repeated discussing of the damages that have been done are in effect also serving to re-traumatize populations, and that we also do need to focus more on acts of solidarities and strengths. So thank you for also pointing that out. I'd like to move on to the next question, which brings us back to the systemic racism to a certain extent. And we would like to invite you to speak to how policies and laws which have and continue to disconnect the Indigenous communities and peoples from the land, the knowledge of their ancestor and their own identity, can you draw the connection between the larger systemic issues and how that manifests for the individual and how they can potentially emancipate themselves from that? Who would like to go first?
Okay, I'll look at this. Definitely can't emancipate ourselves from these laws and policies when they're specifically created to oppress and criminalize and, you know, remove us from our lands and all of our relatives. I think of the doctrine of discovery that would allow Spain to claim ownership of these lands, and also include that because we weren't Christians, we are not human beings, you know, and how the British forced infected blankets to spread diseases among Indigenous peoples in 1763, you know, the Gradual Civilization Act in 1857 that disenfranchised Indigenous women. I mean, there are many, many laws and policies of Canada that continue to criminalize and create these systemic racist systems. From, you know, the Indian Act all the way to Indian residential schools until recently, and just even hearing of the provincial changes to our education of removing the acknowledgement of Indian residential schools. So these are things that Indigenous people didn't create, therefore cannot. You know, how do we change this? And this is where it's so important for our treaty relatives, our allies, to come in and help with these changes to these systems that continue to wound relations between, you know, and definitely create a whole new meaning for reconciliation, which I hear elders talking about, you know, reconciliation rather than reconciliation. So there's a lot of, again, like that, you know, when we're talking about embodiment, that as a mother and a grandmother and a child of the, you know, Indigenous women, is that it's incredible that we continue to evolve our Canadian state into a place of really wounding the people of this land.
Thank you, Lana. Bernadette or Jodi, would you like to speak to this as well?
So the policies and legislation that are still enacted, I mean, if we look at the root of the Indian Act, I mean, if we look at First Nations reserves in Alberta, currently in 2020, high school children are not offered the same curriculum that typical Alberta students are offered. So that's in 2020. So if we think regressively to 1999, 1988, all of these students on reserve aren't being offered, let's say, English 30-1, which you need to apply to post-secondary. Some might, but not all, because there's no curriculum, Alberta curriculum being offered on First Nations reserves. And so there's also, subsequent to that, not having access to the curriculum, there's less money provided federally to schools than there are provincially. And if you work for a provincial school as a teacher, you get to work towards your retirement, your benefits, all your years of work get contributed to this pool. And as a teacher, that reinforces you to want to stay where you are so that you continue to teach with the students, you build relationship, it builds consistency. Of course, on reserve lands, you cannot be a part of the Alberta Teachers Association, and therefore you cannot accrue those hours, that time, that commitment, and it doesn't lift your pay grade. So here we have two separate education systems in 2020. And so my question is, why is it okay to offer a substandard level of education to a particular group of students in our province? It's unacceptable, it's disgusting, and it needs to change. That is systemic racism being embodied in our own province. And that's just the education system. And I'm not moving on to post-secondary. I'm not talking about pre-K and kindergarten. That's just grade 1 to 12 curriculum issues, along with funding issues. And so when we wonder why we don't see, you know, First Nation students graduating from post-secondary, say college or university, well, they're not even getting offered the credentials to apply to go to those institutions. That is systemic racism. You know, and you think about, why doesn't Indian Reserves have gas stations or grocery stores or businesses? We have to go through legally through the Indian agent, which is now Crown Relations, all of that things. It's such a privilege to be able to start up a business on your own land, doing whatever you want. First Nations people don't have that same right or accessibility. There is a ton of policy and legislation that ties their hands behind their back so they are unable to engage in the economic systems that all Canadians take for granted. And same with the Farmers Corporation. The farmers get to sell their grain to, you know, to the co-op, and they get paid a particular dollar for their grain. not the Indians. The Indians have to sell their grain through the Indian agent first before it can enter the co-op. So there's all of this particular policy and legislation under the Indian Act that gets embodied through education, child welfare, economic systems, and they all are crippling for communities. And so it's time to start pulling apart this Indian Act, as it is the overarching system that, you know, feeds and perpetuates all the other systems that follow underneath of it.
Thank you so much for that information, Jodi. That was really very powerful. And I think there are also so many nuances to it that I think are really new for the average person. For instance, I didn't know that Indigenous students have a different curriculum from that of the Alberta mainstream schools. So thank you for sharing that with us today. Bernadette, would you like to add to this?
You know, one of the things that when I used to do Indigenous training, I used to always ask everybody, have you ever gone to a First Nation community, a Métis settlement? Have you ever gone to visit an Inuit community? And it's important that you make your way over there. It's important to go visit over there. Go and see what it's like. I had never lived in my community. As I told you before, I grew up in orphanage and child welfare, and I had the privilege to go live in my community. And one of the things that happened to me is that I broke down. I broke down because of the racism that is still exists within our communities. You know, I was sick one time and I had, you know, a really bad cold, and I wanted to go see a doctor. I went to the clinic over there and they go, oh, we don't have a doctor, but we have a male nurse. So I told the nurse what I needed. I needed antibiotics because I had a cold, a really bad cold and bronchitis. And anyhow, they said to me, well, just go back home and we'll call you when your medication is here, ready. So I went back and I got a call, ding, ding, the old telephones. And they said, your free medication is here. I got so upset when they said my free medication was there. Because when I went to live in my community, they did not have a house for me. I lived in my office for 2 years. They didn't have a house for me. You know, teachers come into our community, they get compound housing. Nurses come into our community, they get compound housing. They have a house that is full, that has everything. It has a fridge, a stove, a microwave, television, beds, you know. When I went into my office, I had nothing, nothing. So what I'm saying is that even on First Nation communities, when you go there, and if you don't speak up, you get treated badly by some of the people that work there. And I had to speak up and I had to say, how many people live in my community? How many houses is there in a community? Why am I still living in my office? So when you talk to me about my free medication, then you need to really look around you, because you know what? We had, I think it was 250 houses, and we had approximately 1,500 people living there. So how many people live in one house? And when I got there, they said to me, you know, Bernadette, you came in the right time. We just got running water and flushing toilets. And this was in 1999. They just got running water and flushing toilets. And one of the things that happened is that the septic tank was too small for the community, because when they went in there to do an environmental scan, they said, well, Indigenous people only wash themselves twice a month, because the only place that you could wash yourself was at the school, was at the church, was at the high school. So everybody took turns to go and have a shower, to bathe their families, without thinking that if I had running water, flushing toilets in my house, I would wash my dishes, I would wash my clothes, I would wash my kids, I would take a shower, I would do all these things, you know, because I have running water and flushing toilets in my house. And I was so insulted, you know, because that's how the reserves were handled. And so that experience that I had was that, you know, it was just discriminatory, and I spoke up, and I just said, this is not acceptable. This is not acceptable. You know, not having that opportunity to say, you know what, you're sick, your medication is here, come and get it. I'm so sorry that you're not feeling well. And so that was an insult, and I spoke up, and that was just one incident that I'm talking to you about. And you know, I could go on and talk more about these, but you know, when I think about how disconnected and how you don't know what a community is like, you need to go and visit them. You need to go see our elders and go see our medicine people, and see what it's like to be on the reserve. You know, you know what, when I went there, it was a culture shock for me, and I'm Indigenous. It was a culture shock for me, and I was thinking, oh my God, you know. So we still have a long ways to go. We still have a lot of work to do. And you know, when I really enjoyed what Lana said about reconciliation. No, there needs to be some reconciliation happening, action, because you know what, I'm getting old and I'm getting tired. I'm getting tired. I've been at this for a long time, since 1987, I told you. So anyhow, I could go on, but I will stop.
Thank you so much, Bernadette. I really appreciate how you can always relate the larger issues also to your very own experiences. I'd like to attach or follow up on something that you just mentioned, Bernadette, in terms of go and see some of these communities, go see it for yourself. What are your thoughts on the newcomers that come to Canada that often have really no idea, no information about the Indigenous peoples here? And how can we perhaps create bridges here so that the newcomers to this land can gain the knowledge about the Indigenous communities, and specifically also the colonial oppressions that Indigenous people still have to live with, and some of the parallels that also some of the newcomers to Canada have experienced, coming also from formerly colonized countries?
Well, I have, I get lots of practicum students that come to do their practicum with my society, and I always thought, how come they don't do practicums on First Nation communities or Métis settlements, or you know, I mean, some of the practicum students, they can actually go do practicum in Holland and Ireland and Scotland, you know, but when it comes down to really educating people within our own country, why are they not able to go to a First Nation community and do their practicums there? Why can't they go to, you know, Métis settlements and do the practicums there, or in rural Alberta? You know, and one of the things that is a systemic issue that is happening within the education system, because I just think I have a few practicum students who were actually in Ireland and as well as Holland, and I'm going, okay, well, how come they don't do that here? So maybe somebody can answer that for me. But it's something that's always kind of like, yeah, my thoughts are there. That would be a very good way of introducing people to the communities, you know, if they went to do their practicum there and really work and be hands-on and understand, you know, yeah, those are my thoughts anyways.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bernadette. Jodi, Lana, would you like to add to this as well?
Sure. You know, the other piece is it's not okay just to do a drive-by in our communities to see how we are suffering. So what I would actually suggest is you pick up the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples that was written over 25 years ago. Start by reading that. Then you can move on to the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action. Read that. Then you can move on to the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Inquiry, and you can read that. And then you'll have a very clear picture about the realities in our communities. And then we can start to talk about how you might do different work in your own agency, so we can start to change the level of poverty in our communities. So actually, I would suggest with some reading prior to visiting.
Thank you so much, Jodi. Lana, would you like to add to this as well?
Yes, so since we're talking about systems, I also, from individuals as having those from the federal government to provincials to municipality organizations, and working with Indigenous communities to create economic opportunities, to create programs and educational systems that help lift our children out of poverty, out of violence, out of those like leaving it all up to Indigenous people to do this and take care of these issues that were created by the systems themselves. So just kind of adding to that, that it has to begin at that macro level in order to even address some of those micro levels. And then, as Jodi mentioned, from the micro level, just starting with readings of those really important documents that actually give solutions to these issues we're all talking about. Why hasn't the governments looked at those documents to create some action?
Thank you so much, Lana. Aside from the,
I just want to add something. And, when we talk about economics, my cousin Edmund, he actually started a sawmill in this community, Fort Albany. And he was actually sued by the government because he chopped some trees and started his business. And he actually countersued the government and he won. And that is one of the things that Jodi had talked about that stops us from actually moving forward. But, when I think about the relationship that could have happened, within the other pulp and paper mills, around Canada, it could have had a different outcome. But the thing is what we have to go through in order to actually move things forward. And I'm glad that he did win. But the thing is that, when you want to start something within your community, it's horrible, what you have to go through. So I just want to share that story because I think part of it, what happens is that, again, those barriers that people have to go through.
And part of the important work is after doing that reading and, really grappling with the systems, is then doing some internal reflection around how are my positions and the jobs of my relatives benefiting off of these systems? So how are the social workers, the social work instructors? How are the prison guards? How are program directors? How are all of these folks benefiting off of Indigenous peoples being a part of the system, and not only benefiting from their wage, but their retirement package, their dental package, all of those benefits that non-Indigenous peoples get to experience are based on Indigenous peoples being part of the system. So that's the work that I put out to each of you, is how do you start to untangle yourself and your relatives in the system that perpetuates this violence?
Thank you so much, Jodi. Those are definitely very thought-provoking issues that are being raised. I've been pondering for a long time in terms of the lack of knowledge that, at least in my experience, the average Canadian has about a lot of these really unbelievable issues and the environment in Indigenous communities. And I cannot pinpoint it. I don't know if it's a matter of not wanting to know or truly not having that information. But what I have found personally very interesting is that in Germany, for instance, people are very hesitant and unwilling to talk about the Holocaust. There is basically the sense that, oh, well, we've talked about it to death, and we just don't want to hear about it anymore. But people are very, very interested in learning more about the lives of Indigenous peoples here in Canada. And the other way around, I've also found, for instance, that a lot of the Canadians that I have interactions with who are not interested in Indigenous issues are very, very interested in the Holocaust. And I'm wondering if it's also, is it too much information? Is it too little information? Is it just an unwillingness to want to look at the mess in your own backyard? What do you think contributes to this?
I think that's a question for your audience, not for us.
Thank you, Jodi. Fair enough. Maybe we can post that question at the end of this conversation. Lana, Bernadette, do you have any thoughts about it?
Just a quick thought around that is that we, again, part of this systemic racism, the system of oppression, is to actually silence those kind of conversations internally and externally. So this, again, is a very huge, it could be another, why don't we talk about these things? Why is our government stopping to even talk about Indian residential schools? Because emotionally, it's difficult. Imagining living through it, you know, carrying it. And there's a whole process, like the previous question or the next question around Indian residential school. There's a lot of people who went through those systems who won't even talk about it because they haven't unpacked or addressed and transcend historical trauma. So very big question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lana. Bernadette, would you like to add something here as well?
Well, that is a very big question. And, you know, I guess part of it for me is that there's so many unresolved issues. You know, I think about what is going on, like in my own life, you know, when I think about what the experiences of my own life. And then when I look at my family and I look at the next generation, and I always think is that, you know, is this ever going to change? And I know for me that it's frustrating because we seem to go, you know, full blown ahead, you know, with this reconciliation. And it seemed like, you know, we were going to move ahead and things were going to change. But I see, you know, what's still happening, you know, look at Tina Fontaine, you look at, you know, the Boucher, I can't remember his first name, but Colton Boucher, you look at, you know, what happened in what's happening right now in Nova Scotia. You look at, you know, that Joyce Machu, I think her last name was. And you look at that and you're thinking, okay, you know, like, why is this still happening? You know, like, why is this still happening? And why is it that we need to continue telling our stories over and over again, you know? And my friend Thelma Shalifu, you know, poor, you know, like she passed away, but I remember her saying to me, you know, Bernadette, you have to repeat yourself over and over again. You need to tell your story over and over again, you know, because things will change eventually, but you have to remind them. You have to remind them because it's not okay. Ovid Mercury used to say, we need to talk about this. So, you know, and now how I see it is that I didn't learn my history till I was 36 years old. I was 36 years old when I learned my history, you know, and it makes me sad that I had 36 years of my life not knowing. And then now my son, when he went to school, you know, when he was young, I couldn't tell him anything because I didn't know anything. He went to school at 21 years old. He called me and he was crying. He says, Mom, I'm just learning about our history. And I am so sad. And he's out in Vancouver and I'm in Ontario. Now it's my granddaughter. It's my granddaughter, you know, who's 19 years old. And now, you know, she's taken Indigenous studies at Simon Fraser. And now we sit down and we talk about it as a family. And I think it needs to start from the family first, you know, because when I married my white man, my beautiful white man, okay, and I said to him, I said, what do you know about Indigenous people? Tell me what you know. And I think that those conversations need to start within your own home, you know, and to be able to talk about it, because I certainly had to do that, you know. So there's 3 generations in my life where I think that because I started this when I was 36 years old, that willingness to learn about my life, right? I can't expect a white person to know about my life if I don't know about my own life. And that's how advocacy starts. That's how, you know, when Thelma Shalifu said that to me, she says, you know, Bernadette, you got to say it over and over again, you know, because it will fall on somebody's ear. And it has. I've had some really good allies out there who have worked with me, who have, supported me, who have gotten me as far as I am today. And, some Indigenous people tell me, go, oh, Bernadette, you're still, you still have your society. Wow. Because and it was hard work to keep it, because you know what, there were times where, the government funders used to say, you know what, you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. And I had to, bring them back, say, yes, I am. This is how we work. We work this way. Anyhow, I could go on like this, forever. Thank you for including me in these conversations. You get me going. So I always tell people, don't get me going. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bernadette. I love your contributions. We were just also talking about children and youth and your mothers. And I would like to ask you, if we take an intersectional approach, can you speak to the aspects of age in different generations in relation to the residential schools and childcare system? So specifically, because the last residential schools really only closed very recently, many Indigenous peoples have firsthand experiences of these institutions. So how can the younger generation of Indigenous peoples who did not live through that experience relate? And how is that communicated as they move through today's educational system in view of that legacy? Who would like to go first?
That's a very layered question. It's very loaded. And, as we think about our organic way in many of our societies around the intergenerational knowledge transmission that takes place, and our young ones are always with us and with the elders, that is our way of teaching. It's through the Indigenous pedagogy. We tell stories together, we scrape hides together, we make dry meat together. And the children are always part of that process with the elders and the moms and dads. And then to have the children completely removed from that system has been incredibly detrimental. And so from what I'm seeing from your question is, how are we able to tell our children about that experience, and how are we navigating through the education system now? Well, we're not really doing very well, as you can see through the statistics. We have huge trust issues with non-Indigenous educators. I mean, it's foundational in our relationship, and we haven't not healed from this. Clearly, we are not on the same page. We are, offering help and being ready for help are two different things. We need some time to do that internal work. We are just learning through the TRC what actually happened. Many of us were just living in houses of violence and domestic abuse and all kinds of trauma-related violence, and not recognizing or realizing that actually this is rooted in the intergenerational Indian residential school legacy. So we are learning about it from outside, and that's a little bit violent in itself. Oh, I am this way because of that, and I experienced this because of that and that. So we need some time and some investment in our families, in our elders, in our communities to do that bonding and reconnecting and healing work. And then we can start to talk about education systems in ways that we see fit through our lens of teaching, whether it be on the land or in the classroom or online now because of COVID. So we need to be trusted enough, because this is part of the fundamental issue, is systemic racism has erased any sort of trust between each other. So we need to learn to trust each other, so that way we can start to do our own work. So then we can sit at the table with you and start talking about partnerships, start talking about how we might walk together in reconciliation, and if that's even possible.
Thank you, Jodi. That was very insightful. Thank you. Bernadette or Lana, would you like to add to this as well?
Sure, thank you. Jodi, you just rock so much. As a child of an Indian residential school survivor, especially being educated at Blue Quills, which was the same building built in 1931 as Blue Quills Indian Residential School, which is 20-minute drive from my reserve of Sad Lake. And being in that educational institution that was taken over in 1970, and then Chrétien and Pierre Trudeau, Prime Minister at the time, first Trudeau, was assigned over that school, and it became the first in reserved specifically for education. And fast forward to 2015 when it became a university, and we were already in our second cohort for a doctorate in our Indigenous knowledge and ways of learning in contemporary times, looking at Indigenous women's economic security, sexual health from those frameworks of Indigenous world views and ways of knowing and doing, being in ceremony, singing, learning making sure that language was so integral to Nehiyawewen, specifically for me, being a Cree woman, into that learning. And the more you learn, the more I learn Nehiyawewen, the more it shifts my thinking to be more in connection to one another because it's embedded in the language. And so I think of having, and I was only able to do that, as Jodi mentioned, by working really hard in reflecting and addressing and confronting intergenerational trauma. I've been through child services. I've lived in many homes, a lot of those statistics have affected many of us. And so, but because I had the love of my grandmother and my, that maternal love has been so integral to coming into my own voice of being able to speak about those things. I had to learn languages on many different levels to be able to even talk about it. So to even educate that takes a different level of learning about your own history, where you come from, your own cultural background, all of that.
Yes, thank you, Lana. And I think what you described there also, I imagine also applies to the young Indigenous children growing up in the childcare system today, removed from their families, removed from their cultures. And so in a way that is then still basically perpetuated and reenacted on yet another generation of young Indigenous peoples. Bernadette, would you like to add to this as well?
Yeah, I don't know where to start. I just have so much on my mind. I really enjoy what Lana said, and as well as Jodi. And, part of it for me, I guess, is, can you go back to the question? There we go. Okay. I think I shared earlier about that I grew up in child welfare, and I'm really disconnected from my community, even though I lived there for a few years. It's way up in the James Bay coast. I have a real issue with trust. It's something for me that I still work on every single day. It's something that it's something that for me is very, very hard to kind of believe that things are going to change, as I was saying, but at the same time, when I think about my own experience, I can only speak about my own experience. I mean, I had a thought in my head the other day where I was reading this on Facebook and on Twitter, and the co-chair of the 94 call to action there, Wilton the Old Child, talked about how he never celebrated his birthday, and talked about how, like in residential school, they did not celebrate birthdays. And I was reading that and I was thinking, like, this is a milestone of every single child every child is a milestone of their ages, their growth, their development, their self-esteem, their foundation of who you are going to be, right? And that he never celebrated his birthday. And I think about the people that grew up in child welfare, you know, and residential school, and how those milestones were actually missed, you know. So many things, like I said, 36 years of my own life, you know, when I think about when I started learning about my own life, but then I think about all the other ones. And sometimes, you know, I would tell stories, you know, to my granddaughter. But, you know, one of the biggest things that I was always afraid of is that I was afraid to put fear in her life, you know, be afraid for her, you know, because I was so afraid that she would get apprehended, you know. And she was 2 years old and she knew my phone number. If anything should ever happen, you call me, you know. She was just a baby. And I think about the fear that I had, and I still have those fears, you know, when children are being apprehended. I think about what they're going to miss. I think about, you know, why are we still doing this? You know, we say that, you know, child welfare is the same system as residential school. I remember sitting there listening to these young moms, you know, who were, you know, they were giving them their parenting assessment, and they were saying to them what a bad parent they were, and, you know, how they couldn't raise their kids. And I used to get so upset, and I used to tell the supervisor and the caseworker, okay, stop it. Stop it. You need to ask this young girl, where was she raised? Where were you raised? And the young girl would say, I was raised in a group home. So where do you learn how to parent in a group home? Where do you learn how to cook, how to clean, how to play with your little siblings, how to, you know, where do you learn that in a group home? You don't. You don't learn that in a group home, because you're raised by family support workers. You're raised by, you know, the manager of the house. So, you know, again, those milestones were taken away from them. So part of it for me is that, you know, I live in fear. I live in fear for children that are born, especially Indigenous children that are born. You know, don't forget, I'm a lifer of children's services. That's what I tell people. I'm a lifer of children's services. Because part of it for me, I live in that fear that our children will be apprehended, because I don't want them to miss their milestone. I want them to know their language. I want them to know where they come from. I want them to learn all those things that I missed, that my sons miss, you know, my granddaughter has missed. 3 generations. So when you start looking at how many other people, if there was 22,000 Indigenous children that were apprehended back in 1960, those are the 22,000 children that have missed those milestones. 150,000 children that were part of the residential school, they've missed those milestones. So we have lots of years to catch up on. You know, one of my greatest mentor and role model is Cindy Blackstock. And Cindy Blackstock talks about the 2-tier system. When they started shutting down the residential school, child welfare was there. And there was that tier system that happened. Some of us never ended up going back home, like myself, from orphanage to child welfare. You know, some of the people that grew up in residential school never did go back home. They ended up in child welfare. They ended up helping the farmers. You know, so part of it is that we have lots of work to do still. And when I think about, you know, like you talk about intersectionality approach, and I think about, you know, you have to have that foundation in your life to really understand, you know, what happened. Because I know some kids that are young, you know, they're 14, 15 years old, they don't know. You know, they don't know, because, you know, right now they live with their mom and dad. They have a home, they live with their mom and dad, they go to school, you know. But the ones that are living in care, you know, when I think about them, they're the ones who are really going to be suffering more than the ones who are living, you know, with their mom and dad in a good home. And I'm not talking about an abusive home, I'm talking a good home. But part of it is that for me is we still have lots of work to do. And I believe that, you know, you got to have that foundation, you know, of wellness, that foundation of growth, you know, that you've learned about yourself, so that you can have that good foundation for your family. anyways, I could go on talking for a long time, like I said, but I just think that, you know, this is a loaded question. Thank you, Jodi, for telling us that. But yeah, you guys are gonna make me cry pretty soon, so I better stop talking.
Thank you so much, Bernadette. Actually, building on the conversation we just had about the childcare system, there is a question here of somebody in the audience. With an alarming amount of Indigenous children across Canada being raised in foster care, what do you think it will take to change the child welfare system? These children are being raised in non-Indigenous homes, having their names changed, taught different languages and religions.
I'll tell you what, start giving the money that you give foster parents to Indigenous parents. Start offering the courses that you offer to foster parents to Indigenous parents. Start supporting the families that you support outside of the system, in the system. And I bet we'll see systemic change, pardon me. The thing is out of all the foster kids that I've worked with, ones that have aged out to adults, to kids in care currently, not one of them has a story to say, I had an awesome childhood. Not one of them can tell me that they ever felt loved and that they belong to a family. The system does not work. It only perpetuates the violence and it perpetuates the system, because when they leave child welfare, more often than not, they end up incarcerated. More often than not, they end up in the hospitals. More often than not, they end up in some sort of institution where they need care, support, whether it's for developmental delays because they were so horrifically abused or abandonment issues. It just perpetuates more systems and cycles of violence. So the solution is simple. Put the money in Indigenous people's hands. Start investing resources into Indigenous moms and dads. Start investing in Indigenous communities so we can support one another. We will fix our problem. We are competent. We are intelligent. We love our children. So of course we will do what it takes to fix it. So invest in our people. That's the solution.
Thank you so much, Jodi. That was very powerful. And I can see in the chat box here that there are some very enthusiastic people agreeing very strongly with what you just shared, Jodi. There was another question actually specifically to you, Jodi, and it was about whether the T&R stories are accessible and studied by Indigenous peoples in their families or in schools. So the question is, are the T&R stories accessible and studied by Indigenous people in families, in schools?
I believe that would be the Truth and Reconciliation.
I believe so, yes. I think that's what it relates to.
You know, thank you for the question. And we live them. So, you know, we are learning about them and we live them. And as I mentioned earlier, we're also learning abstractly about them, which is, you know, difficult and tough to know that your messed upness is actually because of this outside school that, you know, raped and beat your grandmother and then neglected, your mom was neglected and all of these things. So yeah, we're learning, but it's not fun and it's not easy. And there's no investment or resources available to support families in this learning. So, you know, maybe that's something we can partner on and work on.
Yes, thank you, Jodi. Are there any additional questions? I see a lot of comments here in the chat box, but does anybody have any questions that they would like to pose to our panelists? I know there's a lot of very heavy information also being discussed. One of the questions actually that I had was in our previous conversations on anti-Black racism. One of the aspects that has come up a lot, and it resonates with me personally very strongly because I have two sons, and it is the conversation that Black parents have with their young sons as they're raising them, that they may be treated in a certain way by the police and how to respond, for instance, if they are approached by a police officer. And I cannot even begin to imagine having to have these conversations, and it is heartbreaking. Do you find that there are similar conversations happening amongst Indigenous parents and their children?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Yes. So one of the things that came up in our previous conversations with on anti-Black racism is this conversation that a lot of parents have with their young sons growing into their teenage years, and having this conversation around, you may be stopped by the police. This is how you may want to behave or not behave, because more than likely you will be singled out. And as a parent myself, I cannot even begin to imagine having to have those conversations and how heartbreaking that is. And I was wondering if if Indigenous parents have similar conversations with their children as well.
Of course, I'm, as a parent, I definitely love and want to protect my children as much as possible. So we do have these very difficult questions. And I know that because of my kind of inherent parental style of, the families I come from, who especially who went through Indian residential schools, is to develop skills within my children that protects them, right? And so we do have very good debates, and my kids, each of them in their own ways, have experienced racism, so they know, and we talk about it with one another. And, for example, my son, who, when he was 15, when we first moved to Edmonton, and he was with his white friends, they were walking late at night, and of course someone called the police, and they ran into the back alley, and my son instantly sat down on the ground while his friends left. And of course, when he came home, he told me this story, and I'm like, thank you for doing that. And again, my son's response was, I'm the brown kid, I know I'm the one who will, the threats are real the most for being a brown child. So lots of, again, loaded question. And I feel like there's so much more we could say about a lot of this work. And it definitely, as all of us mentioned, we need more action and changes. To a lot of what we've already said is doing the opposite. We need, instead of more criticism, we need more critical thinkers. We need to raise critical thinkers, of those systems. We need more compassion and empathy taught so we can have these conversations. And that is being taken away all the time from our systems, from our children, our future generations.
There's quite a few questions around, what do we do? How do we be better allies? What can I do? I've read this stuff, I've done this. What I think is really important is, in your position, your employment, make space to mentor an Indigenous person. Mentorship is huge in our cosmology, in our worldview. We're always taking younger people in and showing them the ropes, showing them how to be a good human being. That's in our teachings. And so, make space. When you're sitting at a table, say, is there an Indigenous person here? Are there multiple Indigenous people? Include us in your job, include us in your governing systems, hire our people, make space for us in your policies, and read your policy and say, have we made, exceptions for, trauma that might be triggered for people? Is our HR set up in a way that can support Indigenous peoples adequately? Because we are still unraveling some of this messy stuff, and we might need more mental health days than the typical average citizen. We might need to have our psychotherapist paid for, and our elder ceremony, and or our massage therapy, the things that make us well. So look at your own work, look at the places that you are part of, the boards that you sit on, the volunteerism that you participate in, and ask yourself, how can I make this more inviting to an Indigenous person? Who do I know? Who can I invite? And how can I make space? Put your elbows out and make space for us. And let's start building those relationships so that we can work together and really, create systemic change together, because it's all of us in this.
Thank you so much, Jodi. Going back to also the education system, and just now there was an article that came out on the changes to the Alberta curriculum in terms of also not addressing, for instance, residential schools anymore. And it does seem like that from the TRC, we have now gone full circle basically to going back to not actually talking about this very problematic colonial history. What would you say if you had the opportunity to actually speak to the people that are making these decisions?
Can I just go back to, I was trying to put my hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry, Bernadette, my apologies.
And Lana, and one of the biggest things around making room, creating a space, for Indigenous people. And part of it is that, when I do my practicum students, I have more non-Indigenous people that come and do practicum at my office than Indigenous people. And when the non-Indigenous people leave my office after they've done their practicum, their 250 hours, they are so in awe, and said, I didn't know about this. I didn't know about that. I didn't know about this. And I always think about, okay, what are you learning at the university? What are you learning at college? What are you learning, because if you don't know these things, if you have Indigenous week, once a week out of 52 weeks, what are they going to learn? So, and oftentimes the non-Indigenous people that come and do the practicum, they're part of us. They are part of our society. We welcome them, we appreciate them, we're kind to them, because I want them to work so differently with our Indigenous families, our Indigenous children, because one of the questions that I always ask people, say, who did you look up to when you were young? Was there one person in your life that you actually, got something from them? Was there one thing that you got? And if we could have every child having a mentor, every child having a role model, what a world it would be. It would be so different, because part of it is that, we need to be able to give that, even if those kids are being raised in foster homes or foster care, at least having one person. I have a friend of mine who's a foster mother to 3 kids, and she's a fantastic foster mom, but she has one youth worker that works half an hour a week with these children. Half an hour a week. How much money are you being paid? And that's what it is that when I think about, they're spending half an hour a week. Meanwhile, how much are you getting for the government to be able to deliver this program? I know, because I get money to deliver programs. And I tell you something, when I work with a child, when I work with a youth, I work with them. I don't spend half an hour a week with them. We spend more than that. And part of it for me, I just think that there needs to be some room, there needs to be some space. If our children are going to be in care, if our children are going to, then give them that so that they can have a role model, somebody that they can look up to, I mean, when I think about the child welfare system, and I like what Jodi said around reinvesting into our families. We need to reinvest in our communities. We need to reinvest so that there is some actual funding happening there. So when you think about Cindy Blackstock, the class action lawsuit that she did back in 2006, against Canada for the mistreatment of children and the lack of funding that they were getting. And here, we have foster parents, we have group homes, they're getting some good money. We have some agencies who are doing pretty good, So why are we not investing into our families? Why are we not investing into the quality of parenting, the quality of life that our families need, And I see that, but I always think about that one person that could make a difference in that child's life. There are some good social workers out there. I have met quite a few. I have met the ones who say, Bernadette, we don't want to remove these children. Is there any way that you can help us? Is there somebody, a kinship family that can maybe take that child? And you know what? In their database, they actually have red flags in their families. No, that, not that one, not that one. This one would be a really good one, you know? But the thing is that, you know, we're the ones who know who the families are. And part of it is that they need to actually connect with Native counseling, connect with Creating Hope Society, Métis Child Family Services, Bent Arrow, Bent Caffro, you know, the First Nation communities, and say, you know, do you have a home for this child? Is there something that we can do for this child? You know, so I just think we need to think differently, work differently. And that question was really, really important, you know, so I really like what Jodi said, you know, that we need to reinvest money into our families. And so go back to your question.
Thank you so much, Bernadette. Actually, I would just like to also invite the people in the audience to please complete our feedback form. It really helps us to get your feedback in terms of what we can improve or potential topics that might be of interest. So the link for it is here in the chat box. So please take the couple of minutes that it takes to fill out the form. I would also just like to go back very quickly to another question that was posted. Do the panelists support land acknowledgements? And if they do, what do they recommend to make it respectful and meaningful?
Again, a loaded question. Do you want to talk about the degradation of the land? Do you want to talk about the poisoned rivers in the land? Do you want to talk about the complete erasure of the buffalo on the land? How do you want to acknowledge the land would be my question.
Bernadette, what are your thoughts?
I don't do land acknowledgements because when I speak my language, you know, introduce myself in Nehiyawe, when I am acknowledging, again, within the language, it's embedded of making that connection to the land as a Nehiyawe. The one thing I do appreciate about land acknowledgements is that people are actually activating languages by saying the Indigenous groups of that area, they're acknowledging treaty. What, of course, I want to see is action again. Like, what are people, that it's not becoming tokenized, it's not becoming, you know, appropriated and used as a check the box of Indigenous, you know, reconciliation or restoring relationships. And definitely, you know, again, when we're acknowledging the land, is acknowledging your own connection, and kind of going back to Jodi's suggestions before of what is my relationship to this living land, that it is our relative who supply, you know, who carries our life forces. And how are you connecting to all the other relatives of this land, you know, the plant nation, the water nation? What is your relation? And if you don't, then start creating one and work with Indigenous groups and rebuilding the health of our ecosystems.
Thank you, Lana. Bernadette, Jodi, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, for myself, I do acknowledge the land, because part of, I guess, like I told you, it's, you know, not knowing who I was and not knowing who I am, and just learning about the treaties and learning about who I am and how the treaties actually fit into my own life, and understanding the land. And I remember a long time ago, this one woman, she said to me, because I said to her, I said, you know, what is it that I'm missing? I feel like I'm missing something like in my life and I don't know what it is. And she asked me, she says, do you have a relationship with the land? And I thought about it and I thought, no, I don't have a relationship with the land. Because you know, a whole lot of it is that, again, you know, that those milestones that I have missed throughout my life, and understanding that relationship that we have with the land. And so anyhow, I started really, you know, I guess part of it is that I remember a friend of mine used to say to me, you know, Bernadette, when you're going through a really hard time, go sit by a tree, you know, or lay down on Mother Earth, you know, and just spend some time with Mother Earth. And I was probably in my 30s, And I remember doing that, going to lay down on Mother Earth, and I could feel this pulse between my navel and Mother Earth. I could feel this pulse, and she was feeding me my energy that I needed to ground myself, to understand myself, you know, and even understanding the treaty that I come from, Treaty 9. I come from way up in the James Bay coast, way up in the Hudson Bay coast, you know. And I remember sitting down with these old ladies, and we'd be eating, you know, beaver tails and just, you know, like, and they'd be sitting there, you know, watching a fire, and we didn't even speak, because I don't speak my language, but with just that silence with them was so strong, was so, you know, nurturing, was so forgiving, you know. And the reason why I say forgiving is because I had to forgive myself not knowing, and now that I know, now I can talk about it, you know. But this land acknowledgement, where I come from, when we actually started creating Hope Society, I did go to an all chiefs meeting, and I said, I'm not from here, I'm not from Alberta, I'm from Ontario, Treaty 9. And this is, you know, I ended up here for some reason. We never used to have any boundaries, but I'm here, and I would like to do this work here. And I actually got acknowledgement, you know, because I just didn't come here and say, okay, I'm going to do this work, and I'm going to do this because, you know, whatever reason. I'm not from this territory. I come from Ontario. And so respecting where you are, respecting where you are going is so important. When I was in Africa, I acknowledged, you know, like, this is a continent of the Black nation. You know, I'm happy to be here. When I was in New Zealand, when I go to different places, I acknowledge the land that I'm on, because it's important. It's important because I'm not from here. But the thing is that my work is here now. I have built my roots here. I've been here for over, well, off and on since 1993, you know? So part of it is that, and when I first learned about the land acknowledgement, my sister-in-law called me. She was from Winnipeg. And she says, Bernadette, I just came back from this ceremony, and they actually acknowledged, you know, Treaty 1 territory. She goes, I didn't know that I was on Treaty 1. So even my non-Indigenous friends are starting to call and tell me what they had heard, you know, which is really awesome, I think, you know. And I will continue doing that, you know, because I don't speak my language, and I really appreciate, Lana, you know, that you speak your language, and Ruben, that works for you guys, Center for Race and Culture, you know, is so strong, and you know, but that was part of our mind that was taken away. And maybe one day I'll be able to speak. I don't know, but it's one of the things that I do. I do that, and I appreciate what Jodi said. You know, like, it is, we, you know, our land needs to be taken care of. Our water needs to be taken care of. We need to pray for our water. We need to be able to offer tobacco, and you know, and that tobacco is to acknowledge, you know, that our medicines, our water, are not healthy right now. So, but anyhow, I could go on talking about this. Thank you. I'm gonna let go.
Thank you so much, Bernadette. I'm so sorry, but we have to wrap it up. We are coming to the end of our session today. I just wanted to say a heartfelt thank you to all three of our panelists. It was very moving to listen to you, and I've learned a lot. So thank you so much for taking the time and being here today and sharing with us. Thank you also to everybody in the audience. And again, we would like to invite you to fill out the feedback form. It's always very helpful for us to hear from you. And also to invite you to our next upcoming roundtable conversation as well. So thank you, everyone. And I hope you have a happy, safe, and healthy rest of the week. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.